When we think of realism, we're usually thinking of these lifelike paintings like a Velázquez. Or we think of movies where instead of superheroes battling it out, we are shown what actually happens in war, like Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. But realism often implies something else, social realism, meaning art that can show us what's wrong with society. That's what motivated the photojournalism of James Agee and Walker Evans, or Pontecorvo's cinematic masterpiece, The Battle of Algiers. But broadly, we can understand the objective of realism as the desire to be more true to life, more authentic, which isn't to say that Cubism isn't true to life or that a Batman movie can't be haunting. It's just the tension between art that observes its subject and art that represents its subject is an inherent problem in visual art that we can kind of intuitively grasp from when we were 3 years old and gripped our first crayon. But this is a poetry channel. What does this mean for poetry? Is there such a thing as realism in poetry? Now, poets, just like filmmakers and painters, face broadly similar problems, and many, if not all, are motivated to try to make something more authentic. I say it all the time on this channel. A good poem must convince. Creating a product that feels true to lived experience is not easy, and it's especially not easy in poetry. This problem of representation is not new, and it's been discussed by some pretty top minds in the field. And my favorite work on the topic is Auerbach's classic work of literary theory, Mimesis. But this is a practical channel, a hands-on channel where we mix it up. And I know you guys want to learn about stuff that's going to help you write better poems. So with that in mind, I tapped my good buddy Robert Pinsky, friend of the channel and former poet laureate of the United States. All right, he's not my buddy, pal, but he did write this book. Yeah, I did. The Situation of Poetry. Okay? And he's a pretty smart guy. He's super smart. Robert. All right, let's check out the book. But the thesis in the book and some of the ideas I have to share with you is going to be all about what realism means for poetry. And he wants to go back and look at a turning point in the development of English verse during the Romantic period. And the Romantic period is this period of English that kind of ends at the onset of the 19th century. Okay? And Pinsky feels that at this time, there's this showdown between the natural world as it really is and the artificial world of the human intellect. And he describes this conflict as a conflict between two philosophical stances, which we'll get into in a moment. But he feels modernism, which is this period of poetry that reaches its peak around World War II, is the great attempt to resolve this conflict between man v. nature, right, through the use of imagery. So Pinsky's whole idea is that modernism comes up with this new approach, and that anything written after modernism up until now can't help but face the same challenges that the Romantics first tripped over and then the modernists proposed this bold solution to. And he thinks these strategies used by the moderns are still dominant today. Now, his book has aged a little bit, right? So you can see it's kind of a retro-looking cover design here. But I still think, even though it was published like 50 years ago, his vision for the problems we're facing as contemporary poets is still pretty fresh and pretty relevant, okay? And you'll understand why if you keep listening. So what's really important to understand in Pinsky's take is he's not talking about influence. He's not talking about if you read T.S. Eliot, maybe you'll end up kind of cribbing some of his style and writing more like him. He's talking about strategies. He's saying the broad problems that T.S. Eliot wanted to solve still need to be solved. And whether you read Eliot or not, you're going to end up having similar problems that you have to face, right? Just because we have the internets now and we don't wear hats for as many occasions doesn't discredit the fact that we're still trying to solve broadly similar issues in our writing. Whether or not you read the modernists doesn't matter that much to Pinsky. If you don't read them, you'll end up reinventing the wheel anyway. And if you do read them, it's no guarantee you're automatically going to write awesome stuff, okay? He feels genius, individual genius, always was and always will be the kind of deciding factor in terms of your outcome there. But strategy is the best way to understand these broad approaches to technical problems that transcend style, okay? So let's get back to the meat of Pinsky's thesis, which goes back to this problem the Romantics stumbled across. Okay? Now, I've talked about the Romantics now and again because I feel everybody should be familiar with them. And I think it's important for you to do so, but that's not exactly what Pinsky's point is. Pinsky isn't like you need to become an expert in Romanticism. Pinsky just is identifying the Romantic period as this fulcrum point. In particular, he wants to talk about John Keats. He wants to talk about Keats as this exemplar of the person who really nails the problem best. He's a late Romantic. He's an outsider. He's kind of a boy wonder. And for Pinsky, his poem Ode to a Nightingale really just nails up. It's like the perfect shot at this conflict between thinking and feeling, human and nature, abstraction, and unification. And the speaker of the poem wishes he could be like the nightingale, at one with nature, just kind of singing and having a good time, just being in the moment completely. But the speaker realizes he can't be like the nightingale because being at one with nature would entail a loss of intellect, a loss of the sense of time, and ultimately a kind of psychic or even literal death, becoming a sod. So to Pinsky, Keats's poem is this kind of recognition that its text itself contains abstract thinking and language, and that poems are formed out of abstractions. Because language, unlike things in the natural world, is conceptual. Even the most basic element of a poem, the line, is inherently abstract because it repeats, it returns again and again to the margin. This repetition and the observance of repetition requires intellection, requires abstract thought. It judges, it distinguishes, it divides. Pinsky frames this split as a conflict between two modes of understanding. One is nominalism, the idea that concepts are nothing more than labels and have no existence in themselves. And the other is realism, the idea that concepts are real and exist independently of nature. Poets, like Keats and those after him, according to Pinsky, want to be nominalists. They wish they could be, because that would mean all concepts would cease to exist and we could be at one with nature. But because they can't do that, they're forced to adapt a certain amount of realism. Because without a certain amount of realism, poetry itself would be a jumble of meaningless and unrepeatable sounds. Realism, then, is this kind of curse or burden of poetry, where the intellect of the poet is constantly interfering with the poem that's being composed and distorting it. Abstractions disrupt the pure and direct appreciation of things as they are, aka nominalism, and the very nature of poetry itself bends towards realism and abstraction. Now, we'll take a quick time out here because I'm sure everybody's a little bit confused as fuck. Okay? Pinsky's use of the term realism here is very, very different than the realism we discussed at the opening, the realism of film and visual art, because Pinsky is discussing a philosophical realism, the kind of realism that guys like Plato and Aristotle advanced. But this kind of realism, if you think about it, actually isn't so completely different than the realism of a realistic painting. This is going to be a little mind-blowing, okay? The realistic painting doesn't wish to actually show you nature as it really is, okay, from the perspective of nature. It wishes to show you nature as we see it, okay, as humans see it. Nature with all the shadows, the lines, the perspectives, the shapes, the colors. In short, all the abstractions of human intelligence fully embodied in the work itself. Because dogs sure as shit don't see what Vermeer saw. It takes a human brain to properly perceive a human painting. Pinsky seems to suggest that realism is the default stance of poetry, and I would suppose, though he doesn't say it, part of the classical frame, the kind of epic realism we find in Homer and Virgil, or the kind of comic realism in Horace. Further, Pinsky is saying that when it comes to John Keats, realism and classicism broke. Keats destroyed them. He destroyed them because he said nature is more beautiful than anything poetry can reflect, and that made him sad. And furthermore, poetry as a technology was thus a failure. All right, well, that's a little unfair to Pinsky, who never said that part about poetry being a failure. And if he finds out I mischaracterized him, he's going to kick the crap out of me next time we grab beers together here in Beantown. So instead, to steelman Pinsky's argument, we could instead say he reads Keats's poem as a big moment, a moment when the problems of realism first come into this sharp relief. Now, what Pinsky certainly believes is that by the time modernism took center stage a couple hundred years later, with T.S. Eliot and his bros, the problem of realism hadn't gotten any smaller. But the modernists came along and felt they had an answer. Their answer was, as Williams famously wrote, William Carlos Williams here, no idea but in things. In other words, nominalism. Let things be things. Let nature be nature. But again, this being Pinsky, who's smart as fuck, nothing is quite so simple. Because nominalism wasn't actually their strategy, even if they themselves said it was. That's because no ideas but in things doesn't work. Because as we've already established via Keats, human language is inherently abstract and inherently made up of ideas. Instead, Pinsky says the actual strategy of the modernists was to efface the primacy of the poet's ego by letting other crap in the poem speak on their behalf. Pinsky calls the poet's ego discursive, meaning it tends to write a poem that badgers you about poetic truths and explicitly states what the moral of the poem is. This discursive element is alleviated through the employment of imagery in modernism. It's not completely eliminated, according to Pinsky, since that's not possible, but at least it's kind of backgrounded. That's the goal. displace the voice of the poet into rando garbage, like a red wheelbarrow that you shove in the poem. Done. Solved. Keats can go home now. Have a fucking cough drop. Well, of course, this strategy, as Pinsky shows, dominates the late 20th century practice, with some poets understanding its limitations, like Bishop and Merwin, and some failing to, like Bly and Rethke. Pinsky approves of the former, who adapts, because they adapt modernism successfully for their purposes, and he frowns on the latter, who, in his opinion, failed to derive why the strategy was developed in the first place. Whew. All right, so what's the takeaway here? Every time on Reddit or anywhere else on social media, anyone asks how to improve as a poet, everybody immediately jumps on and answers, read more poetry. Everyone says that. And yeah, sure, that's true. Being illiterate shit won't help you develop as a poet. And the more you read, the more you'll naturally come to appreciate the huge variety of technique out there and how poets of different eras and backgrounds focused on different aspects of the craft. But there are limits to just going goblin mode on the Norton Anthology. Just hoovering up a lot of data won't make you a better poet automatically. Pinsky, in this book, is asking you not to think of poems as flowers, each one with its own beauty and merits. He's asking you to think of them as contraptions, as mechanisms, as little killer robots. Their design must take into account the inherent limitations of a technology that tries to use abstract thought to depict life as it really is. The pursuit of authenticity, of finding yourself, of returning to nature, or whatever the fuck it is you want to do with poetry can only work if you're realistic. Not only in the sense of realism, whatever the hell that means, but in the sense of taking careful stock of your tools and choosing the right strategy for the poem at hand.